You're a Swede with an English husband, so you had a long day yesterday.
Woo, yes. Well, I have an English husband so far. We'll see about Saturday night.
It's Saturday.
Yeah.
We're talking about the football for non-fans. It's quite a day here in Visby yesterday. I've been speaking to people within the Nobel Peace Organization, if I can call it that, the Nobel Organization, and I'm fascinated to hear the process that they have to go through to announce the winner. But just tell us how soon before the official announcement you found out.
About 10 minutes before the announcement in Oslo, they called the office. And obviously I thought it was a joke. And then just, things almost started spinning and I was like, oh, what do I do now? What do I do now? I remember being very sort of like, okay, I need to get control of this. I need to do something rational here. The first thing I thought about was like, I need to turn off my notification on my phone because I feel like my phone is going to blow up. That was like the first thing I did. It's like, okay, I got this. But
Had you any indication whatsoever that you were even being considered?
We knew we were nominated, but a ton of organizations and people are nominated every year. It doesn't really mean that much. And some media had been speculating that we were a contender, but we didn't really take that seriously. So it's just sort of like, it was nice that some people were even mentioning us, but we did not expect to win.
So your phone rang 10 minutes before the announcement. They just said, you're going to win it, get ready type thing.
Well, he was very, very bureaucratic in a way. He's like, I'm calling from the Norwegian Nobel Committee, and he sounded very Norwegian. You won the Nobel Peace Prize. He said, I'm calling with what I hope is good news, which immediately meant like, oh, it's not the Nobel Peace Prize.
The most prestigious award in the world.
I was really thinking that perhaps he needs the number of someone else that we know. Maybe he's calling in to tell us that we didn't win. So a lot of thoughts went through my mind. And then, of course, he said it, and then he read out the first sort of short nomination of why we won it. And then he just very abruptly like, well, I have to go now. We have a press conference. Bye.
So you watched the press conference to see if it was true, presumably?
Because when I hung up, my colleague's like, well, are you sure it's real? I was like, I don't know. What was his name? I was like, I forgot already. We had to watch the press conference. We decided to not celebrate.
Yeah.
So we had to watch the press conference first. And then we knew it was real.
And how many people are in your organization? How many people are we talking about here as the group you had to announce it to?
Well, we are a campaign coalition, so we don't have individual members, we have organizations. So we have over almost 500 organizations around the world in 101 countries right now. So it's a huge network, it's a huge coalition of organizations. So loads of people who have worked tirelessly on this issue. And it's just such a nice thing to share the Nobel Peace Prize with so many people, and so many regular people in a way, not heads of states or celebrities or big shot politicians, but really just like regular people who believe in the cause and work. And it's the kind of work that very rarely gets credited. You don't get a lot of attention for this. People are like, oh, you're being naive, all you hippies trying to work to get a better world. So it was really, really nice to get that kind of moment of recognition on that kind of international stage.
And you've actually brought it along. Am I allowed to say that?
Yeah, just
I'm
don't steal it.
Suddenly worried about the security implications. Can we see it?
Yeah, sure. Wait. This is our best campaign.
There's obviously just one. I know that's stating the obvious, but this is the only Nobel Peace Prize that's been produced this year. I mean, it's amazing, isn't it? And when you look at that, how do you feel personally?
Kind of like I want to bite it.
It looks like a chocolate coin.
I know.
Why are you just carrying it around in Visby, by the way?
Well, it's become like a great campampagn tool.
Yes.
I mean, people get really excited. I mean, you want to hold it and look at it, right? So it gives me an opportunity. Yeah. Not very many people have that.
How do you feel about it? Because I know that you're very cautious about being called the Nobel Peace Prize winner, because it's not you individually, it's the organization. But ultimately, it does come down to symbolism, doesn't it? It's that medal, but it's also, you're the face of this campaign. So what's it meant for you personally?
Oh, a lot of travel. But it's been such an honor to represent this campaign and sort of get to work with people around the world who are just doing, so much great stuff and really, put kind of a normal life and a normal career path on the side and choose to do this. I mean, the campaign is full of so many talented and committed people that could have done anything. They could have been hugely successful bankers or lawyers or even politicians, but they chose to work for non-profit organizations, chose to work on these things and put all of their skills and efforts into that. And it's such a, I don't know, I feel so extremely fortunate to get to represent this campaign.
It comes down to the peace treaty, doesn't it, for you? So just take us through that, what it is and what it promotes.
It's a treaty prohibiting nuclear weapons. And in one way, it's very similar to the treaties prohibiting biological weapons, chemical weapons, landmines, and cluster munitions. Since World War II, we've progressively evolved the laws of war. You can no longer just do whatever you want in warfare. We have restrictions. You're not supposed to target civilians. You're not supposed to have disproportionate military force in a conflict. And this treaty just follows that. We started to then, chip off at the kind of weapons that have indiscriminate, inhumane impact, the weapons that are meant to kill civilians. So we banned chemical weapons and biological weapons. We banned landmines. We banned cluster munitions. But somehow, we forgot to ban nuclear weapons. We have kind of created this world where nuclear weapons are an exception. They're not real weapons. They are a status symbol, a power tool. We've connected it to sort of strategic balance in the world, and we don't see it as a weapon, but it is a weapon. It's a big bomb, big radioactive bomb that creates mass suffering and chaos. It's not magic. They don't have magic qualities, these weapons. So we need to treat them in the same way as we treated other weapons. We ban them.
You mentioned World War II. I mean, the counter-argument is obviously because of these nuclear weapons and their existence, there has been no World War III.
Well, you can't really prove the absence of something like that. Since we formed the United Nations, there has been no World War II.
But it's a deterrent. That's what they call it, nuclear deterrent.
Yeah, I mean, how far do we go with deterrence, for example? I don't question sometimes that perhaps some people can be scared enough of nuclear weapons to not do anything. But, I mean, you could dig around landmines in your garden and say deter burglars. It's not a good idea. It might, but it might also be the neighbor's kid that trips on it and dies. It's not a good idea. So what we do know today is that the world has changed drastically since the Cold War. We have a multipolar system. We have many more nuclear armed states. We have a completely new security scenario where we have cyber warfare. We have the new developments of fully autonomous weapons, a complete change in the military. Nuclear weapons no longer fits in that. This idea that wiping out an entire city is somehow acceptable today. It's not. And perhaps they also are preventing us from developing the kind of defense and security that we need to have to protect ourselves. Wiping out cities is not how we protect ourselves today.
Your success has been getting countries that don't have nuclear weapons to sign up to this treaty, but isn't that, dare I say, quite easy because they don't have them? Shouldn't your job really be focused on the nuclear powers and convincing them to get rid of their systems?
I don't think so. I think every country will be impacted of nuclear war. If there's nuclear weapons, the impact of that does not stop at borders, doesn't respect sort of geography, does not definitely recognize alliances. It will spread across time and space. So this is really a priority for every single country, and every single country has a voice in this issue. And what we do know is that we can't force a country to disarm if they don't want to. We have to make them want to. So this is how we've seen norms change behavior, for example. Countries like the United States and Russia did not sign the treaties banning landmines or cluster munitions, yet they have restricted their behavior. On landmines, the production of landmines has fallen to almost zero now. Huge areas are being cleared. We are changing their behavior with or without them. And it's a little bit like human rights. We don't let Saudi Arabia dictate the pace of human rights, right? We let Sweden decide, like, this is like how we do feminist foreign policy. This is how we, women's rights are doing. We don't wait for the last one to change. In a way, we see it a little bit also as perhaps the smoking ban. Can't force the smokers to quit if they don't want to, but you can go outside. So what we're doing is that we're creating the standard. Here's the international law. And international law matters. It does, even if they don't sign it. And then we drag one country at a time up. And when you have the majority of countries there, that becomes the new sort of norm where we compare these countries. So countries that don't join this treaty are going to be on the outside, and they are going to be the ones who are not in compliance with international law, and that's going to mean something.
Do they take meetings with you? Do they speak to you, ministers from these governments, nuclear powers like the UK, the US?
Yeah, absolutely. Not at a very high level, often. We requested some meetings, but we definitely have contact with their ambassadors and their people at the UN in Geneva and New York on a very regular basis.
Because Sweden's an interesting case in point, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Because Sweden doesn't have nuclear weapons, but it hasn't yet signed the treaty. What's your understanding about the dynamics involved there? I've obviously spoken to the foreign minister this week and the defense minister, spoken to both of them about it. And you know, their common ground is that they've started this inquiry. But what's your understanding about the dynamics behind the scenes there?
Well, I mean, I think it's quite straightforwardly about courage. Do you dare stand up for your conviction, or do you do what the United States tell you to do? There is nothing in the current sort of defense agreement with the United States that prevents Sweden from joining this treaty. Sweden does not participate in any activities related to nuclear weapons. So if that's already the case, you can sign this. But they haven't yet, and they're hesitant to it, because the United States is threatening. Because the United States knows that this treaty, with or without them on board, will impact them. That's why they're trying to stop Sweden from joining it, because they see the power of international norms and treaties. So what it is that the United States is saying, you shouldn't join this because we'll punish you afterwards. And I think Sweden should call the bluff. I don't think they will. I think it's just them trying to bully countries into doing what they want. Sweden, we know that the Swedish defense agreement, as far as we know, unless there's something that we don't know, does not involve any activities related to nuclear weapons. The treaty only covers nuclear weapons. It only prohibits activities around nuclear weapons, not conventional defense agreements. You're able to be an alliance member and collaborate with nuclear armed states like the United States, but you are not allowed to carry out activities around weapons of mass destruction.
There's obviously a lot of concern in Sweden about threats from Russia. We had a big military exercise which was supported by the United States. Sweden isn't part of NATO, utterly dependent actually on the United States if there is some sort of incursion from Russia. So what do you understand this threat to be? Because what you're probably referring to is a letter from Secretary Mattis to the defense minister. What do you understand was in that letter, and have other countries received the same letter?
We don't know exactly what the content is of the letter, but there has been some very stark warnings towards Sweden that
the cooperation will end? Is that
or that, yeah, or that they will have an impact, they say. There is no evidence that they will actually impact, that they will change anything currently. But what they are saying is that we will not use nuclear weapons on Sweden's behalf, but they shouldn't anyway. Under no circumstances is it ever acceptable to Sweden that another country mass murders civilians, violates the laws of war, wipes out entire cities, hospitals, schools on our behalf. That's something that shouldn't be in our security interest anyway. And what is more problematic is that the Russian nuclear weapons are a threat to Sweden. And that's why we have to act on disarmament. That's why we have to say that that is unacceptable behavior. Sweden is not going to prevent the nuclear threat from Russia by saying nuclear weapons are acceptable. It's totally okay to threaten with them. You're just going to encourage and legitimize it. If we are worried about Russian nuclear weapons, if we are worried about North Korean nuclear weapons, we need to say we don't want that. We can't do the same thing ourselves.
Aren't these quite high-minded arguments for someone perhaps living in Gotland who's very concerned about, Russian troops literally coming in, whether that's rational or not, or fair to Russia, and coming in and taking over the island, and the idea that the Americans won't come in and help because of this treaty that Sweden may or may not sign?
I doubt
which doesn't actually affect Sweden because it doesn't have nuclear weapons.
I think Sweden is in the United States' security interest to collaborate with. I don't think that Sweden not wanting to mass murder civilians is going to change that. I mean, are we also going to stop complying with human rights laws just because Trump says so? What kind of threats are the United States going to demand of Sweden so that they will protect us? Where do we draw the line in a way? Where are we our own country and we get to decide our own rules?
But Mattis is drawing the line, saying sign it by all means.
It will have consequences, you say, but we don't know what kind of consequences it will have.
Well, he says there will be less cooperation, military cooperation. It threatens.
It is in the United States' interest to collaborate with Sweden. Sweden is important to the United States. Will they give that up just because Sweden does not like weapons of mass destruction? I don't think so.
What about the inquiry that some people would call a fudge, because the government can't agree on whether or not to sign it? Are they kicking it into the long grass, do you think, or are they actually seriously looking at an inquiry where they can decide whether or not they will sign the treaty?
I think it's a serious inquiry, of course. I mean, it's a very Swedish tradition to take their time and to make up their mind very slowly and try to create sort of common ground. So I think it's definitely the Swedish method in a way. It's not a fast, paced government sometimes.
What will the sticking points be, do you think?
I think it will be this kind of looking into the details on the military alliance. I think that if you look at the treaty and what it prohibits, the use, the possession, the development of nuclear weapons, and then you look at the agreements between the United States and Sweden, you see quite clearly that there is no contradiction in between there. So I think that Sweden, if you want to continue your collaboration with the United States, you have to be confident and say, we are a great partner, we are a great ally to the United States. We don't like weapons of mass destruction, but we will still collaborate with you in any way in conventional forms, according to our agreement. And I think that will provide a lot of confidence and will put a lot of pressure on the United States to not back out of that. It will be very difficult for them to withdraw an agreement that's in their interest based on something that isn't even in the agreement.
I know you've got big concerns about the Trump administration, that sort of pressure they're putting on the likes of Sweden. Where you are giving Donald Trump some credit is in North Korea and South Korea. Take us through your thinking around his diplomacy with Kim Jong-un and also with the South.
Well, I mean, I don't know how much thought through diplomacy it is, but I think there was a great development that they met. Diplomacy is a much better alternative than threats to totally destroy each other. I mean, just a few months ago, we were actually worried about nuclear war and thinking that these two countries might attack each other any day. When this false alarm in Hawaii happened, I was just at the height of the tension. People thought it was real. People thought they had 30 minutes in Hawaii left to live and put their kids in sewers and in basements and trying to run away from a nuclear bomb, not knowing if they were going to survive or not. So obviously, meeting and talking and shaking hands is a good step. However, the actual agreement is quite vague. It doesn't have a lot of content, so we haven't solved the problem. I mean, I know Donald Trump wants to portray it like that, but we haven't solved the issue. They've just kicked it down further the road. Now starts the real work. And of course, there is a big concern that once you get to the table and try to actually hammer out the details of how this disarmament is going to happen, you might get stuck, and the Trump administration might, well, we tried diplomacy, let's go for war.
Also, the definition of what disarmament means. Talk us through that, because there could be completely different perspectives from Pyongyang and Washington on that.
Absolutely. I mean, all countries, all the nuclear arms states have said that they want disarmament. But, another time, when things are better, when everyone else has disarmed. And of course, that doesn't really mean anything in practice. So North Korea says that and in the agreement, it says that they will work towards, not do, but work towards, the total denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. For North Korea, that means also South Korea has to, sometimes they talk about how South Korea needs to remove themselves from the nuclear umbrella of the United States. Sometimes it even involves Japan or things of China or the US conventional military leaving South Korea. For the United States, they say, North Korea needs to disarm. We're not talking about our own weapons. And I think that this is really the problem, and this is why the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons is so important, because it really does not treat nuclear weapons as a problem of one country. It's not a problem of the other. It's the weapon that is the problem. So if we actually want North Korea to disarm, we're going to have to look at nuclear weapons as a problem, all of them, not just some.
And that's a huge debate, and it's going to slow the whole process down, isn't it? Just working out what on earth they're debating. But could I put it to you that this peaceful process came about because Kim Jong-un had nuclear weapons? That's why Donald Trump was happy to meet him, and that's something that he can overcome, and that's what created this environment. If he didn't have those nuclear weapons, Kim Jong-un wouldn't have got that meeting.
This shows how incredibly vulnerable the world is to nuclear weapons and why we really urgently need to get rid of them. We can't let a dictator suddenly become one of the most powerful people in the world.
But we have. He's on the same status as the US president on the world stage.
It's awful, isn't it? And I think that this is one of the big criticism of the Singapore summit was also that it was almost like a welcome party to the club. And this is what we've created by not looking at nuclear weapons, by thinking that American and British and French nuclear weapons are fine, the others, they are the problem. There are no right hands for the wrong weapon. The problem is the nuclear weapons. So this is also what the Treaty on the Prohibition will do. It will stigmatize, delegitimize. When the rest of the world says, I don't accept this weapon. It's inhumane, illegal, and unacceptable. You start to put shame and stigma. Nobody thinks that Assad is the most powerful because he has chemical weapons. No one thinks that that's worthy of respects or handshakes. Why? Because we prohibited the weapon. We stigmatized it. So this is what we have to do with nuclear weapons so that we are not vulnerable to these kind of madmen with nuclear weapons.
So is your work in trying to convince the general public, actually, to get a sort of groundswell of opinion so politicians then change their perspective on nuclear weapons?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that for far too long we thought that this was an issue of experts and the kind of military strategists, the think tank people. And they are the ones who tell people that, oh, it's too complicated. Don't bother your little head with this. It's, leave it to the important people to figure out. They're not going to figure it out. We had 8 years with one of the most progressive American presidents, someone who I think really believed in nuclear disarmament and wanted to do something. He could not do it because of the military, because of the expert advice, because of this kind of nuclear weapons are so valued by his own team around him. So we have to attack that, and that is going to happen through pressure from people. So we have to make this issue, and this is what ICAN has done, and this is what the treaty is doing, is to make it understandable to people, make it a choice, yes or no to nuclear weapons. No sort of half measures, no hypocritical, yes for me, no for you. But nuclear weapons, good or bad, what's it going to be? And that is going to create sort of much more pressure on governments. And we're already seeing how the treaty is having an impact. We've seen big banks, for example, like Deutsche Bank, do a policy saying that we will not invest in illegal weapons, nuclear weapons. Germany hasn't signed the treaty yet. So they still go there. We've seen the two of the 5 biggest pension funds in the world, the Norwegian and the Dutch, also announced that they pull funds away from companies that produce nuclear weapons. We are going to make it shameful and difficult for everyone who's connected to nuclear weapons, and thereby encourage disarmament.
Have you found yourself, you're working in an environment where in the background there's the rise in populism. We're seeing that at Almedalen this year, aren't we? Do you find yourself up against that movement? Because they often talk about defense. And they're certainly not negative about nuclear weapons, not that they're promoting it, but they're certainly strong on defense. Are you finding yourself countering them when you weren't expecting that a few years ago?
Absolutely. I think from my perspective, there's no accident that the nuclear weapons threat is rising as nationalism, authoritarianism, fascism is rising. These two things go hand in hand. Nuclear weapons is inherently undemocratic, authoritarian kind of weapon. This is really about threatening civilian populations in a way to say that the state matters the most. We can do whatever we want to people in the name of security.
How are you countering their narrative?
By
because
bringing
you can understand that fear, right?
Absolutely. But I think that we need to lift up people. We see that big progress happens when we make people the most important thing. We saw that, for example, just in the refugee crisis. When we saw the pictures of a 3-year-old boy on the beach, that's when we wanted to help. When you make it about, the structures and the housing situation and all these abstract things, it's so difficult and, yes, dangerous. But when we look at people, because inherently I think that people are good, and people want to have the same thing. They want a safe life for themselves, for their friends and family. And when you look at a person who is suffering or has gone through something, that's when you can see movement. We saw it, for example, with the gun debate in the United States, the Parkland shooting. When these high school kids rise up and say, this happened to me, I suffered, I did this, it's really hard to say, but Second Amendment. And this is what we've done with our campaign. We have made it about the humanitarian consequences. We have made it about the survivors of the nuclear weapons in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but also the survivors of the nuclear testing. The people who were treated as test objects and were treated like they didn't matter, where the nuclear armed states just blew up their own country. So it's really, when you talk about it as a human, for the human consequences, this is what happens when a nuclear weapon bomb. When they talk about deterrence, they're talking about threatening to mass murder 1 million civilians like you and I, wipe out London, wipe out Stockholm, and everyone who lives there, all the hospitals, all the schools. It's not a military target, it's cities. Nuclear weapons are not made for military targets, they're made to wipe out cities. And I think that when you do that, you realize that this is not security, this is not actually going to make me safe. Mass murdering civilians is a violation of international humanitarian law, does not cause security.
Beatrice, thank you very much indeed. And you're a great example of, trying to humanize that story. And I know there's been a lot of pressure on you, hasn't there, over the last year as well. because you've been attacked by a lot of these people as well, but you've come through it and you're here and you're in Sweden and you're not going to win the football.
Don't wait.
Thank you.
You know, we'll see. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.